Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April Chicago in Focus. Chicago in Focus is a series of talks put on by the League of Women Voters of Chicago and the Union League Club of Chicago. My name is Catherine Mardykes, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the Chicago League. Before we get started, just a few words about our two organizations. Founded more than 140 years ago, the Union League Club of Chicago emerged from the Union Leagues of America, an organization created to support President Lincoln's Union. Since its founding, the club has upheld the sacred obligations of citizenship, has promoted honesty and efficiency in government, and supported our cultural institutions. We are in sync with each other. We're not as old as the Union League Club, but we did celebrate our centennial in 2019. The League of Women Voters of Chicago is a nonpartisan grassroots organization encouraging informed and active participation in government. Formed from the movement that secured the right to vote for women, the centerpiece of the League's efforts remains to expand political participation and to give a voice to all Americans. We pursue these goals through voter service activities, such as voter registration, information for voters, poll watching, and candidate debates and forums, through education of its members and the public, such as tonight, and to lobbying the government on selected issues, and through observation of the functioning of governmental bodies to monitor their accountability and transparency. And let me just put this in the chat in case you're interested in finding out more about either of our organizations. In the chat, you can find a link to either one. So now let me turn things over to Hollis Burgess. Hollis is our wonderful treasurer, and she and Kate Oshida have put this program together. I'm going to you'll need to unmute yourself, Hollis, and I'm going to put you in the center and take myself out.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're going to be addressing tonight the affordable housing, how it's currently defined, how the lack of it can impact the city, and what are some of the roadblocks faced by city government agencies and private developers in expanding the affordable housing supply. Our guest speakers today are going to try and help us understand that hope, and I'm sure they will. So we'd like to welcome Kyle Smith as Director of Housing and Community Development for the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, and he helps elected officials and municipalities, they're fun words to say, collaborate on shared policy goals in housing and community development, diversity, and aging in place, including the Homes for a Changing Region and Aging in a Changing Region programs. Before joining MMC, Kyle led a program at the Center for Neighborhood Technology to help neighborhoods add affordable housing in equitable transit-oriented developments. He is a past chair of the Illinois State Chapter of the Congress for New Urbanism. Enrique Castillo is a senior planner at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP, with 5 years experience in affordable housing issues, community development, and transit-oriented development. In addition to Enrique's planning experience, he works to engage communities across multiple sectors, including community development, workforce development, and education. He also plays a major role on the Diversity, Equity Inclusion Committee of the Illinois chapter of the American Planning Association. Our third speaker, Bill Edgar, is Senior Vice President for Chicago and the Midwest region of the Preservation of Affordable Housing nonprofit organization, overseeing all development activity for their regional office, as well as the implementation of a HUD Choice Neighborhoods Initiative grant focused on the Woodlawn community. He has served as Deputy Commissioner for the Chicago Department of Planning and Development's Housing Bureau and serves on the boards of the Chicago Rehab Network, the Network of Woodlawn Special Service Area number 47, Kenwood, and the Legislative Committee of the Illinois Housing Council. Our speakers will answer questions after they have all presented, and please put any questions you have in the chat And we can begin now. Thank you. First up is Kyle.
Hi, do you want me to just introduce myself? I'm happy to do that.
You can do that.
Floor is mine. Hi, my name is Kyle Smith. I'm the housing director at the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus and very happy to be here. I'm going to begin, with a few opening words from things I've learned from my work working with municipalities as to why affordable housing is important and what it means for a community and why housing supply is important. So just a little bit of information about my organization, the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. We are a membership-based mayor's organization in the Chicago region. We have approximately 275 members, and we were founded during the Daley administration to be a body through which mayors work on a variety of policy issues together that do not neatly tuck in municipal lines. Chicago is a member of ours. Much of the work my program does within MMC does focus on suburban communities. The program that I run as our housing and community development program has a couple of different components. We work with communities on community development issues, but my main job within MMC is to represent towns interested in housing policy, various programs they can implement to the benefit of either their housing stock or their residents or both, and then help them implement that policy. And a big part of that too is understanding why housing is important. And I think that, when it comes to thinking about housing, it's a very complicated, wonky subject, and it's very important to think first about the individual in a couple of different ways. So when we've talked with elected officials about housing, we often emphasize housing for all phases of the life cycle. And if you think about that a little bit, I think about my life cycle from being a child in a house to being a college student in group quarters to just starting out my own career in a studio apartment, to where I am currently. I currently have larger living quarters with 2 children. And then when I downsize and retire, the things that I need and am able to do with my ability differ each stage of the life cycle. So what we often encourage municipalities to think about is, do you have the supply of different kinds of housing for different folks at different stages of that life cycle? So that's one. And then I think related to that, but a little bit different, is housing at all income levels. And some of that also relates to the life cycle. When you begin in your career or looking for work, you may not have financial resources, and when you retire, you are on a fixed income. And then there are others, I think, that do not have the income or wealth levels throughout their life cycle that we also need to really consider. And I think that's a third part. What's a good goal is that there should be a choice, no matter what you earn or you do, or your background, or the wealth you were born into. Everybody deserves a place that's theirs and is safe and decent and affordable. So what does it mean for a city? I think when we think of city or community, and we have that housing stock that allows people to put down roots throughout the life cycle and allows choice no matter what people earn or who they are. We have a city that's more likely to have new stakeholders that are always putting down roots. The new Little League coaches is one thing that I like to talk about. And in my neighborhood, we see that a little bit, but we're a neighborhood of privilege, and we do have younger families putting down roots here, but that's not every community. I think that it provides social supports, particularly when you have generations living together. I think we saw this during the COVID-19 crisis when older adults in particular were isolated in their homes. It can be beneficial for the workforce, ensuring that those who work in the community teachers, police, and fire, and I think especially service workers can live where they work and then spend money where they work. And then finally, I think that if we have a balanced supply of housing, different types of housing, different price points, it promotes diversity. It really, I think we live in a very segregated city. There have been barriers to opportunity here for a long, long time. And the better integrated we can be living together rather than separately, the better we can encourage everybody to have good access to resources. Households often follow affordable housing. So, one story that I like to tell is my own story. I live in the Edgewater neighborhood of Chicago. I never imagined that I would be here 13 years later, but I first moved into my neighborhood because this is where the affordable housing was at the time for my wife, who was in school. And it was important because we stuck around. And I think that is something, when you think of the life cycle and housing choice, is something that you want in a community. You want options where people can choose and have that choice, no matter where they are. But I think that what we're seeing is kind of a perfect storm, and I just want to go over a couple of different issues that I think we're seeing and turn it over to the other panelists. One is that Chicago, the region, the United States is undergoing pretty significant demographic change. One is that households are living longer, and many households are having fewer kids, and I think that that's creating a lot of demand for kinds of housing that weren't necessarily built over the last 50 years. But we're also becoming more unequal, and I think that is also important, that the price of housing has outpaced the increase in wages in the last 15 years, in particular, and left a lot of people in the dust, and a big gap between what the market can provide and what people can afford. And then a lot of this is becoming turbocharged right now with rising interest rates. So I think that there are a couple of different issues. One is supply. There's a lot of kinds of housing that was constructed historically for folks at different stages of the life cycle that is not constructed that frequently now. Sometimes this is called the missing middle between big apartment buildings and the single family homes. It can be like 2 flats and accessory dwelling units. And in the city of Chicago in particular, those kinds of buildings are, if not disappearing physically, being down zoned in neighborhoods of opportunity. But I also think that there's a very deep need for affordability for the housing insecure that's completely different than the supply issue. So one issue is that we need more housing. We need more housing, but also there's a tremendous need for affordable units for those that earn what's considered 60% of area median income. And that's because housing costs have just outpaced income growth for sure since 2010 and at least since 1980. And that is very different because the market, the private market can't fill that gap on its own. It's really a public commitment, I think, to help that part of our population and our income distribution get housing. And so it's really both things is I think what we're seeing. We need more supply and more types of housing, but we also need a commitment to helping, a financial commitment to helping people afford where they can live. So I have more thoughts than that, but that's typically what we talk about at the local level. And I think that no matter the community that my organization has worked in, at least one of those things with regard to housing has held true. And I think that it's my job to pass the baton, so to speak, to Enrique.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me here tonight and thanks for the invitation. Again, I'm Enrique Castillo. I'm a senior planner at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. also known as CMAP for short. So we are, for those that are not familiar with CMAP, we are the Metropolitan Planning Organization mandated by the feds to serve this metropolitan area, which is the northeastern 7 counties of Illinois. Basically, every county that touches Cook, we serve with a total of 284 plus municipalities. So quite the region, including Chicago and its 77 communities as well. So I particularly work in local planning. Our agency has been tasked with a regional comprehensive plan, which we call Onto 2050. And in the local planning department, which is where I work, we're tasked with working with communities across those regions and helping them, provide them technical assistance and local planning endeavors, making sure that, as a regional agency, we have a regional plan, but, how do we get our communities that we serve to achieve those goals at that level? So we work at the local level with these communities. And we have been doing this for some time now. We partner up with a lot of other organizations, such as Kyle's, and we do housing work through that. And then we as an agency are also developing our own agenda when it comes to how can we serve our region as it pertains to housing topic areas as well. So, but I think one of the things that I do want to actually set the stage as we continue this conversation is by defining, what is affordable housing. I think some of us might know and some of us not, but it defines affordable housing as a home where folks do not spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing, based on the area median income of that area. So, and this is for both renters and homeowners. In this definition of affordable housing, the 30% of income is assumed reasonable to expend for housing. Anyone that's spending more than that percentage on their housing is considered cost burden. And what that means is that, as we're talking about, that regional goal, that, city goal of, economic development, if you're spending more of your dollars just on housing, that leaves less dollars to spend in the community and, promote that local economy as well. So just wanted to kind of set that stage with, what the meaning of affordable housing is, as we continue this conversation with the panelists. So, but I think, one of the questions that I was asked was, what is that gap in affordable housing, and what are some of those solutions that we're looking into? But a couple of weeks ago, Chicago's Department of Housing Commissioner mentioned that the gap was about 120,000 affordable housing units were needed. And many folks are always asking, what is that gap and how do we fill this affordable housing? How do we build it? And that's the $1 million question. Communities across our region want to know what that gap is, and then also who makes up these gaps, that need the housing. As we think about housing for folks in all the income buckets, right? No matter how much you make, everyone is going to need housing. And like Kyle did mention, right, at the different stages of life as well. So, in our region, we know that our millennials and our Gen Zs are coming up, and they're looking to decide, where they're going to be living, the type of homes they're going to be living in. Do they rent? Do they buy? And then on the other side of that coin, we also have, a large population that is, transitioning into that senior bucket. And, that comes with, do they decide to downsize, from the home that they currently have that might be too big, or do they decide to age in that home? Does the home have the necessary accommodations for them to age in place? And if, again, and if they don't, is there somewhere for them to downsize? Is it affordable? As a lot of our seniors are now on fixed incomes, do they have the means to be able to age in place or find a new place? So I think that's one of the biggest questions. So. And I think along those lines, we talked about, the definition of affordable, is the definition of affordable housing adequate, and addresses a particular sector of the community. I think that here in this city, the Department of Housing has been working really hard to create new initiatives and policies to address and preserve affordable housing. And we know, because we know that there is a gap, right? It's already been stated what that number is. But some of the policies and legislatives that I think the Department of Housing and the City of Chicago have been working on is, for one example, the Affordable Requirement Ordinance, which was recently revamped in an attempt to close that affordable housing gap. Anti-conversion ordinance, this is basically making it a little bit more difficult for developers to buy homes that are multifamily homes and buildings that have multiple apartments and units and convert them into bigger and often more expensive single family homes. In Chicago, this is one of our staples, these types of homes, and these contribute to the naturally occurring affordable housing stock. And I think, we need to preserve that. And I think, between the work that we've done with our partners and in-house, we've worked with a few different communities such as Albany Park and Bridgeport to help them with like some of these deconversion of homes and preserving the naturally occurring affordable housing. So, and I think, another thing that we talked about was, the development of ADUs, accessory dwelling units. The city has also created an ADU pilot program to help create the supply of affordable housing in the last year. So, but there was a ban in this for quite some time. So now that's been reversed, and now looking to use this as a pilot to create more housing, affordable housing. And then ETOD, right? Equitable transit-oriented development is another tool that the city is using. So I'm going to pause there because I don't want to steal Bill's thunder, but I would like to introduce Bill as the next panelist as we continue this conversation.
Good. Can you hear me? Good. Don't worry about my thunder, Enrique. You were great. Thank you. Well, first, I'd like to thank the League and the Union League Club for inviting us to participate in this. I've been asked, I think, to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that developers face, and some of the challenges to actually getting affordable housing built. So I'll try to address that as best I can, and then whatever I miss, don't hesitate when time comes for questions. I'm going to share my screen. I do have a few slides because I think for context, it would be helpful. I think that's me. Good.
Yeah,
So again, my name is Bill Eager. I'll do a couple of introductory slides and then just talk through some of the challenges. So I am the Senior Vice President for an organization called POAH, which stands for Preservation of Affordable Housing Incorporated. We are a nonprofit affordable housing developer. We've been around about 20 years. We own and manage, again, as it says here, 13,000 units in 11 states. We're pretty busy in Chicago, where we have about 2,500 units. Between New England and the upper Midwest, those are our two sort of biggest areas of investment. We do rental housing. I should state this up front. So, there's different types of affordable housing. There's, rental housing and for sale housing. So we don't really do for sale affordable housing. It's kind of a different animal, has its own challenges, and it's not something we've gotten into. We also do mostly housing for either, families, 1, 2, 3 bedroom units. And we do a lot of housing for seniors as well, typically people 62 years of age and older. We don't do a lot of what we call supportive housing, which is housing for people who are homeless or are at risk of homelessness. I know a little bit about that, but that's a particularly challenging and demanding part of the affordable housing world, but not one that we're in very deep. That said, I think some of the things I'll talk about are also affect developers of those types of housing. So, and we've been busy in Chicago now for about 15 years. We started in Woodlawn, and we've been sort of spreading out ever since. We're now in about a dozen neighborhoods in the city and a couple of suburbs. So what do we do? As it mentions, we build. So we do two things. We do new construction. You'll see some pictures of that. That's sort of ground up, which is what I think people generally think about when they think about new affordable housing. But we also do a lot of what we call acquisition rehab, and that is the purchasing and the rehabbing for the long-term preservation of existing affordable housing. It's probably 2/3 of what we do, It's also economically probably a little more efficient. But oops, I jumped ahead of myself there. And then we also have our own property management company. So we have an affiliate. So we manage everything that we own. Okay. And so just for context, I think I lost one of my pictures here, but people have sort of preconceived notions about what affordable housing is. These are a couple of hours. The one up on the upper left corner is the most recent new construction deal we did. It's in Woodlawn by the Green Line. We call it Woodlawn Station. This building is 55 units, and then there's commercial space on the first floor. It's quite nice. And then the one at the bottom is a senior building that we developed a few years ago. That's the building in the background, and in the foreground are the sort of garden space and plaza area. There's some really lovely outdoor space. The picture that is missing from here, and I'm not sure why, is I had a picture of another building that we own. It's an existing building in Austin, a senior property that we bought a few years ago and will be rehabbing for long-term preservation. Oh, there it is. I fooled myself. So that's called Corcoran Place. That's a senior building that we've owned a few years now. That's sort of in our pipeline to be rehabbed and set up for long-term preservation over the next year. And then this too, these are a few interiors. I don't know what sort of notions people have about what it looks like, but particularly new construction affordable housing, most of it is really quite lovely and is virtually indistinguishable from anything else you'll see in a neighborhood. So, these are this is what affordable housing looks like on the inside. So it can be very nice. So a little bit about our work. So in terms of key challenges, for us, it's, identifying and securing the resources necessary to do the work. Because one of the biggest challenges in affordable housing is that it's expensive. It is a deal for us can run anywhere from, as I say here, a $15 million deal on the low end is pretty inexpensive. We've got a deal right now that we're trying to get started under construction. That's about a $40 million deal. We have some that are much larger than that. They're not typical, but it can be pretty expensive. So that's pretty daunting. And to do the work, it requires a mix of, again, private and public funding. So, we go to banks and we get loans from banks and mortgages like everybody else who's a developer. But, because we're doing affordable housing, we need lots of public resources to sort of underwrite to sort of subsidize basically the cost of the construction so that the property can be supported with the lower rents that are implicit in affordable housing. So, that's a big challenge is identifying and securing those resources. Again, they're limited. It's very competitive. We compete against our peers. We have good relationships, always knock on wood with our public agencies. But again, they only have so much money. So, and then, there's the time and cost of it from the inception of a deal to, getting under construction and through construction, it can take 3 years, 2 to 3 years. And in that time, you're spending money, $1 million, $2 million. And so there's, significant risk involved. So you have to be sort of set up to be able to be patient and secure the funding necessary. And, the deals themselves are typically pretty complicated financial structures because of some of the tools that we use. It's not as simple as going to get a mortgage. All those government sources, they're different types. They come with their own rules. They're targeted to, different income levels. And so most deals become a process of sort of layering in a fairly complicated financial structure. So, and they require sort of long-term guarantees to investors and all that, all of which is to say it's not an easy world to enter. I get on a fairly regular basis calls from entities that, want to do affordable housing and want to know how they get started. And most commonly, it's a church that, probably has land that they've had for a long time. and they in their membership think it would be a nice thing to develop affordable housing there, which is true. But it's, and it's sort of hard to coach them through the process of how they break into it. Again, for all these reasons, the costs you need to carry, the complexity of the financing. And it's a difficult world to break into. Typically when new entities like churches and others come along, we encourage them to partner up with an existing developer, get a couple deals under their belt, and then go out on their own. And then the other things, that are complicated, it's not as bad in the city, I think, as it is in many suburbs. Land can be difficult depending on where you are. Obviously, in the lower income neighborhoods, there are more available parcels. It's a lot harder in Lincoln Park and Edgewater and Lakeview than it is in South Shore or places like that. But that is a challenge. And then the others, zoning can be a challenge, particularly in the suburbs. Local politics, again, that's very neighborhood by neighborhood, and same with NIMBYism. There are neighborhoods that are much more receptive to affordable housing than others. So we work with, resource challenges, again, as I mentioned, is probably the biggest single challenge for us. There are three main entities that we work with. The city has a Department of Housing. The state does housing through a group called the Illinois Housing Development Authority. And then there's HUD, and we work with all of those on a very regular basis. There are a number of sources, but there are really kind of three primary categories. There's something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, which I won't go into explaining because it could make your brain hurt, but it is probably the single most important tool for financing affordable housing in the country. And then there are other various sort of federal and state cash resources. And then in certain neighborhoods, there are tax increment financing resources available. In a typical deal, which I didn't lay this out, but a typical deal, there will be usually a private mortgage, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, whatever. But behind sort of that mortgage will be, financing through tax credits, which comes with all sorts of investors and that sort of thing. And then behind that, there are typically other resources from the city and the state. And so it's not unusual when we're doing a deal to have 4, 5, or 6 sources of funding that have to be pulled together and secured to get a deal done. And just a sense of kind of what's out there. So all of these entities have been very good to us over the years. So the city of Chicago roughly has about $200 million a year for developing affordable housing. I think last year, again, that created about 3,000 units. Now, when you think about that, that's a pretty good year, I think, for the Department of Housing. But when you think about the reality that the city's 120,000 units short of what it needs in terms of affordable housing, you get a sense of how daunting the challenge is. And then IDA has about $1 billion a year for the entire state, but they produce a lot of housing in the city as well. So even if between the two of them they do 5,000 units a year, compared to 120,000, it's helpful, it's important, but we're not making a huge dent in the need. And then the CHA has some of its own as well. It does, importantly, one of the big things the CHA does that probably doesn't get talked about a lot is the CHA administers the federal Section 8 voucher program, which serves, I think it's more like 56,000 households a year in the city. And that's hugely valuable. And I know Section 8 can be controversial, but is a hugely important source for serving households. And, rent subsidies in general are, I think, vastly underfunded and probably could be the single most important tool if we could get more of it one of the things that happened in the 80s, going back to 40 years ago, the federal government cut HUD's budget by they cut the budget for affordable housing by 70%, some crazy number, and most of that was by cutting back drastically on the Section 8 program. And so we and needy households have been feeling that pinch ever since. So and so how can everyday people help? So what do we do? I think outreach, to your neighborhood groups, to the folks in the league, to your older people, to state legislators. Really, there's a crying need for more resources for affordable housing. There are potential tools out there, but I think a lot of it is, lobbying and pressure and all that sort of thing. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There are sort of two big kind of legislative priorities on the table in Chicago now. One is something called the state housing tax credit. It is a tax credit that would basically mirror that federal tax credit I referenced earlier. It's been floated around Springfield for a few years now, and never, quite seems to make it through the budget process. It is up again. There's a House bill and a Senate bill, and again, it would raise another $30 million a year for affordable housing in Illinois. It's called Build Illinois Homes. We're a big proponent of it, but it's going to take a big push to get it through the budget process this time. And then another one that's really kind of limited to the city. It's called Bring Chicago Home. There's a real big coalition of affordable housing groups that want to increase the real estate transfer tax for properties of more than $1 million, and that money would be dedicated to providing housing for people at risk of homelessness, which is a particularly hard population to serve for a couple of reasons. One is, the subsidies needed to build it tend to be higher because they tend to have very, very low incomes. And that sort of housing, when you work with that population, you also need resources for social services. Social workers, whatever people need. They're particularly what we call high need population. And so, resources for that population are very limited, and this would go, a fair ways to address that. A couple other points I was hoping to make that what did I do up here? Oops. That I wanted to mention. So I mentioned what the city and the state do. Oh, in addition to what the city does with its resources, it also runs something called the Chicago Low Income Housing Trust Fund, which is technically a 501c3 set up by the city, but it also provides rent subsidies to households. I think about 10,000 households. No, I'm sorry. 1,000 households a year receive rent subsidies through the trust fund. It's a wonderful organization, but they too need more resources. And then the last point I wanted to make was, I think it was Enrique was talking about cost burden earlier. So in the city, so you talk about people who are considered cost burden, that is, they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. In the city, 48% of renter households are considered cost burdened. So half of the people who rent are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. And it's 40% overall. It's 30% for homeowners too. So they're not immune from that, but it hits renters particularly hard. And then I think that's it for me. So I hope I haven't gone too much over my time, but I'm delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I'm going to start off. Kate, who worked on this with me, threw her back out today, so she couldn't come, but she had a question that she'd like answered. and I'm going to read it. My understanding is that rents for affordable developments are pegged to regional income scale for household size. In a particular neighborhood where a development will occur, the local income level could be, and probably are, much lower. Won't the rent rates for that particular development be too high for the people who actually live there in the neighborhood? And I don't know who wants to try and answer it.
I can take a crack at it because we deal with that all the time.
Okay.
So yeah, we do with the, so that it's called what's called the area median income. And it is a calculation done by HUD every year. And it is basically pegged to the 5-county region, whatever, it's, several counties. It's, point of controversy that the AMI level is sort of regional and not a separate one for the city, but nevertheless, that's what it is. And just to give you a sense of what that means, so for a household, for a 3-person household, the area median income for a 3-person household as of this year is $93,000. Most of the funding that we use allows you to set rents and incomes up to 60% of area median income. So that's still $56,000. Just our sense of scale. So, but when you get into a particular neighborhood, by the funding source, sure, you can go up to 60% of the area median income, which would be, I'm generalizing here, but you can go up to $1,000 or $1,300 for a 2-bedroom. But the reality, even though you're legally allowed to do that, the reality is that you're limited by whatever the local market is. So it may very well be that Englewood or Woodlawn or wherever you're doing something, the market rents are well below what's allowed. And so your rents really get set by what the market allows. There is that maximum up there, but in certain neighborhoods, you never get to there. So a lot of ours, where we're allowed to do rents at 60% of area median income, they're often set at like 50 or 55%. So, but yes, there is a mismatch between city income levels and what the area median income says, for sure.
Regarding an author of the book Evicted, mentioned the problem of those who are trying to buy a first home with a mortgage. And Bill, you deal with rentals, so I'm not sure, but Enrique and Kyle can maybe address this. They're trying to buy a first home, but because banks prefer to lend money to companies that are buying up homes because it's more secure. And any ideas what can be done to help these folks? And let me throw in a little extra in there. There's a lot of deconversion going on. I mean, they came after our building to how would that affect the affordable housing market? Because I can't see them, and I can't see where I live in East Lakeview. I can't see them turning some other than the 4+ ones into anything that's going to be affordable. So you can there's 2 parts to that. So you can take whichever part you want.
Yeah, I can take how about I take the second part of that question?
But Kyle with the first part.
And I can take a crack out of it as well, because I just went through that process, looking for a home and, reaching out to the resources that I have and know about. Let's think about those. Now I'm answering the first question. Let's think about those folks that, they might have like a language barrier, right? I'm first generation. My parents went through that process and I don't know how they did it. I really understood that process, and I'm fluent English speaking and know where to find resources. But I think that's the big component that's missing, is that education piece, working with our communities in the city, our local not-for-profits, and just like really educating residents on like what that process is, who can offer first-time home buyers, what else is out there in the buffet of options when it comes to buying a home, if it's your first one, But yeah, it was difficult, even with all the resources. It took me and my wife and my son a long time to find the right home. We wanted to stay in the community where we had been for the past, 13 years, but didn't really find something that met our needs and that was within our price range. So, I think education is a big component to that. And then to the second part of that question, the city does have an anti-deconversion ordinance, and I think that's really big. We talked about how a lot of Chicago housing stock is that multifamily, right? The two flats where, sometimes the landlord lives in the home and they rent out one of the units, and that contributes to, their mortgage. And if, they can no longer stay there, and then that home is deconverted, now you have two families that are displaced. And you have only one family now that lives in it. So there are a lot of deconversion ordinances, or this deconversion ordinance now is a way to at least combat that and mitigate. There's huge fees that these developers are having to pay into, the bucket in lieu of, demolishing the property and deconverting it. So I see that as a really big resources. In Avondale, I'm currently working there, and that's something that they're experiencing. And then just, helping the community realize that, these ordinances are in place, and so they should follow up with their other folks as well. So.
And I would add, I agree. And I would add another, potential benefit that's on the, that's been implemented right now near transit stations is the Connected Communities Ordinance, which relaxes parking requirements. So there are a couple of different dynamics, I think, that lead to why deconversions occur. One of them is that the city code historically has required a certain number of parking units on a property. And if you've seen a typical Chicago 3-flat, there's not a lot of room to accommodate additional parking if it's not already there. So it's a lot easier sometimes for the developer to say, well, there's all these requirements in place if I do X, but I can make a boatload of money if I do Y, which is deconverted to a single family home. And it's under the prior code, that was the path of least resistance. My understanding is that has been relaxed under Connected Communities, and we're seeing different outcomes now, which is some of the buyers were talking about buy up properties and then keep them as multifamily homes, which is good. The particular dynamic, I don't necessarily know if I have a specific policy solution, but it is a very real thing that is happening, which is that there is a buyer out there, a business buyer that has a lot of cash, which the typical homeowner or even someone who might be a mom and pop landlord doesn't necessarily have. And whether that will continue in a time of high interest rates when cash isn't as flowing as freely as it was before, I don't know. Maybe those in the development world would know better than me. But that is another reason why some of these policy tools are really important, because it is an unequal playing field financially, between some of these big investors and home buyers, or just a regular household looking to buy a 2-flat.
The comment on the transportation, because I have mixed feelings about the transportation thing. The building out on Broadway around the corner from us just converted from a parking lot in that neighbors, people in this neighborhood where we have very little parking. I'm at Belmont and Sheridan, could rent monthly spaces. So now we've lost all that parking to I think it's mostly studio apartments. Now because they have to supply some parking, there's ramped parking behind each level of unit, but you've taken several hundred parking spaces and made it, and it's condos, it's not rentals. So it's not really in the affordable housing market. And do developers get a benefit if it's a transportation building, or do they just not have to supply as many parking spaces? Do they get any tax benefits from building on, near the L or on a bus line or whatever the
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, the relief from parking is a benefit, because it can make it easier to, build more units if you have to do less parking. I don't know that there are any tax benefits available. You get some relief from the city zoning code. generally is what the benefit is.
I think, one thing to remember about ETOD developments is that it incentivizes folks not to, own vehicles, right? Because they now live near accessible transit, right? Whether that's the train, and, under the new ordinance, it includes major bus lines as well. So it really does incentivize folks, or maybe not incentivize, but it really attracts, folks that, are willing to not own a car, and you rely on public transit as well. So
Here we have, I think the additional dwelling units ADU ordinance, which is in pilot, is a good idea. If someone can rent a home in their basement, attic, or their couch house, it adds to the affordable housing in all neighborhoods, plus the extra money helps folks. Do you think this pilot will become law across the city? It's a question for all of you.
I think that it will be up to the Board of Aldermen to, establishment across the city. And I think that this is an area where it is helpful for alders to hear from their constituents that they are supportive, because in my experience working with elected officials, there's some concern, particularly in residential neighborhoods, adding new housing in single family areas, many of which I think are exempt from the ordinance, that will have a detrimental effect on the neighborhood. I don't think it's true with ADUs. So that's my answer to that question. And then I have an observation as well, which is that, if ADUs are, a desired priority, one of the things I've learned about ADUs is a third of them rent for free. And the reason for that is that they can provide intergenerational housing, for an older adult or a boomerang kid. They can provide housing for a caretaker, related to like the situation that we just described. I do think that's very important with ADUs because not all of them are affordable, but they do provide a lot of housing flexibility for those that need them. And they probably won't solve the affordable housing issue on their own, but they do add a new option in our housing stock that is often missing.
Can I ask a question on that? Because when we first in our lives lived in the city, are there requirements for these ADUs as to exits, number of exits you can have, access windows and that? I remember when we lived in the city, you had to have so many feet above ground, windows above ground, and that. So it became a, can we sneak this one in type of thing. So what are the restrictions for people with to do ADUs?
That is a great question. Unless the rest of the panel knows the answer, I do know that was extensively studied in the building code to create a better pathway, so that homeowners or building owners could rehab them affordably without sacrificing some of these health and safety issues. Because there are health and safety issues, with the ceiling height and not having 2 exits and all of that stuff. NHS of Chicago does have a guide up on their site as to some of the specific code requirements that's for homeowners. But I know that when the policy was put in place, that was considered pretty extensively.
Okay, we've kind of reached the end of our time. I want to thank all 3 of you for being here. It's been very, very informational. I now have more questions, and Bill has put his address in the chat saying that if we have questions, we can
feel free
contact you. If the others want to do that, they can do it. I have all of your addresses, so we can contact you that way too. I would like to extend on the part of the League of Women Voters of Chicago that if you see ordinances that you think are valuable, or any kind of change that you see and you need public support for, please contact us. We have, our membership, we have our social media. If it's within our power to support you and to help ease things and get things passed that will help people, that's what we're here for. We're here to educate and we're to help.